Hello, brothers. We're back with Laura Mundo's Belmont, continuing on page 10 of this mimeographed 8 by 11, 8.5 by 11, awfully typed manuscript. It embarrassed me when they told me in greater detail when I was a teenager later, and even today as a grown woman. Discussing my parents' intimate life seemed to be beyond the scope of decency. To me, it was a matter that should be known only between them and God. I was reading more and more about God in a big book called the Bible that I found in the bedroom sitting room bookcase, which Ma read sometimes to herself before going to bed, and that I also saw at the churches to which we went and heard about God there. God must be the same one Ma called the Lord at times also. When she would say to me when she tucked me in bed, "Rest in the Lord's arms, little one." She didn't like the children's prayer about the Lord taking your soul if you die during the night. She felt it frightened children, she said. I would go to sleep wondering how big the Lord's arms must be if they held on to the whole world. My sisters said that the people who ran Papa's church never made love at all, that anyone knew about, although there were rumors about babies, dead babies, being found in convent walls and cellars when they were torn down, nor did they ever marry at that time and have big families and small incomes, nor ever were out of work. Their problems were not the same. It was easy enough for them to talk, my sister said. It was rather a bold step for my mother, per se, to take in divorcing my father in 1918. She was known by her own family as Turn the Other Cheek Emily, and divorces were something new and frowned upon, not only by the churches, but society as well, and friends, relatives. It was not known then that the alcoholic was allergic to alcohol, if he didn't have enough willpower not to drink it, to keep down the pressures of the atmosphere or its atoms. I thought that were painful, perhaps, and after the drinker's individual atoms had been raised in vibration by the alcohol he had drunk. And drinking to excess was only a symptom. It was realized by psychiatrists of his disease, or psychological or mental problems which needed to be straightened out first, and from which he was trying to escape by drinking. Psychiatrists, doctors who cured the sick mind, my older brother Jed said, were just beginning to practice, and not many people went to them yet, even if they had the money. Other people thought you were insane just because you went, even though the doctor might decide that you weren't. As I grew older, I sometimes thought that perhaps Ma decided that she had to make a life of her own in going through with the divorce in order to preserve her own sanity, or we children would have no one to take care of us. Or maybe she would start drinking herself to forget her problems. Your father didn't set a good example for his children, Aunt Flo told me later, who had us all over at her house for the day that Ma went into Suffolk County Courthouse for the divorce trial, which the judge granted without any argument. My older brother Jed and my oldest sister Abby were two of the witnesses against Papa. He himself did not come to the court to contest the divorce. Nobody knew where he was, but they had a pretty good idea, they said. The next time we had to move when Ma couldn't pay the rent. In the days before one paid the rent in advance, she did not leave a forwarding address for Papa with the post office. She never saw him again. I never saw Papa again until I was grown and married. He was dying, then a tired, gray-haired old indigent, with a beard now, in the charity ward at Bellevue Hospital in New York City. He had asked the authorities to reach my sister Matilda to tell her he was dying. She had stayed in touch with him, especially when she was going with a Catholic boyfriend, and turned for him but never married him. Papa disappeared again later. Matilda had located him in the past through the New York City police. The first time, not that he had been arrested. He had never contacted her before. Matilda was at Papa's bedside at the hospital when Prissy and I finally joined them. After a train ride up from Boston where we both lived, but it says when. At the time, he didn't recognize us, of course. I wondered what his life had been in the interim. Emily, Emily, Papa whispered in his final moments. That was all. We didn't tell Ma. We were not sure if it would make her sad or happy. A brilliant, talented mind had been lost to the world by improper channeling or guidance or lack of self-discipline, a product of his mother and father, who were a product of their mother and father, in turn, and so on back. But someone has to put on the brakes and start out from where things are. I decided some people could make it despite any obstacles. My Uncle Tom, Aunt Flo's husband, was a witness in the divorce action. He did not smile that day. He and Aunt Flo paid for the divorce bills. There was no free public divorce counselor at that time in Boston or anywhere. Poor people had to go on living together whether they wanted to do so or not, and not remarry. Although rich people could get divorced, mostly in Paris, France. My father's people were well-to-do. My grandfather, Afonso de Granada II, owned one of the oldest and most exclusive department stores in Boston. They never had sales. Granada's Galleries on Commonwealth Avenue. My father's parents lived in a big yellow mansion with a white columned porch across the front of it on top of Corey Hill in fashionable Brookline, just outside of Boston. My father was the only child. One of my father's Spanish ancestors had been an admiral in the Spanish Armada back in the 1600s. They lost to England, but not because the English fleet was so much better, as history says, but because they became disabled in very bad weather as well. My grandfather, Donata, had been a wealthy merchant in Castile, Spain before he came to America, and opened his store in Boston. My father's mother was Corinne Kernan, a beautiful, well-known debutante of Irish descent whose father helped to control the election vote in Boston for many years. She made her social debut to Boston's upper crust in Back Bay when she was 18, but the blue-blooded aristocratic lodges and Cabots had already moved out of the 500, as society was called, by the time the lace-curtain Irish had come in, as opposed to the shanty Irish. Grandmother de Granada seemed to think that she was still a debutante for years later, says here, according to the society columns of the Boston Sunday Post, my sister said, calling her grandma instead of grandmother. They told me it was too friendly, so I never did. My mother's father, Sergeant Edward Clark, had been a policeman in Franklin Park in Dorchester. He was killed when a middle-aged man, he was hit on his high, gray cardboard policeman's hat while wearing it by his own billy club. Seized by a pickpocket he was trying to apprehend in action, and a crowd gathered to watch the elephants in the zoo there one Sunday afternoon. My mother's mother, Polly Clark, was a mother and a grandmother. Grandma Jones became too fat, my sister Abby said, and her heart gave out at the age of 50. Abby dated everything from when someone got fat or lost weight. She pecked like a bird at her own food so she wouldn't get fat. It didn't matter to her if we didn't have much to eat sometimes. Her temper that often got away from her might have been better, I often thought, if she ate more. She was angry. Our maternal grandparents lost one son, Robert, at the age of 5, when he was run over by a coal wagon. The horses had become frightened by an automobile after they first came out and ran away. Little Robert, unfortunately, had been sitting on the curbstone. Grandma and Grandpa Clark had a daughter younger than Aunt Flo and Ma, Tilly, Matilda. She had run away also like the horses. She went with a girlfriend, both aged 15, one night when everyone was asleep to try their luck on the New York stage, leaving the classical note on the pillow. Aunt Tilly played the piano. She had studied classical music since a youngster, but would lapse into rickety tick that sent the old parlor spinet bouncing in an undignified manner when her parents were not around. Her little friend, Louise, sang in the children's choir at church. The New York City police found little Louise and brought her back home, but not Tilly. When she was 18 of legal age, she wrote her folks, but not often. She was in Hollywood, California, she said, the last time she wrote. She was an extra, bit player in the movies, but we never saw her in any way. Our mother's people were Yankee, way back to before the American Revolutionary War, when our original ancestor, a sea captain, Jonathan Summers, came from England and settled in Boston. One of our relatives had been in the Massachusetts infantry during the war. We were eligible, therefore, to belong to the DAR, a patriotic organization called the Daughters of the American Revolution. There was the Sons of the American Revolution also, which the De Granadas were not, but we didn't have the money to pay for the dues. Poor white people and Negro people, even with money, didn't belong there. For although their ancestors had fought in the war also, that made the American colonies independent of England. I learned all that in history books that I read for fun, and encyclopedias and dictionaries, and even Roget's Thesaurus. My father had gone to Harvard Medical School until he began to take the class in anatomy. He couldn't stand to cut up cadavers, dead bodies, let alone living bodies, in surgery. He was an artist, and as most great creative people are, he was very sensitive in all ways because of the pressures of the creative energies that come that make you want to paint or whatever in the first place. This I had figured out in my own mind. If atoms are the building blocks of being, as it is said in my brother Jed's general science book, atoms are made up of energies, and energies create physical pressures and then mental, or vice versa. Papa would walk around a caterpillar on the sidewalk rather than step on it, my sister said, but what he did to our mother's mind didn't seem to count with him. I'm sure that it did, however, and that he had terrible thoughts about himself as well, being weak, as my brother Jed said, that only more drinking would turn off in his mind for a while. Each were the cause and effect of each other. His mother and father disowned Papa when he dropped out of Harvard College. They took him back later and offered to finance him to a school called the Sorbonne in Paris, where he would learn to become an accomplished artist. Somehow I don't believe this, which is what he had wanted to do in the first place. His mother and father had insisted that he be a doctor. In fact, Papa had already shown talent at Dover Academy and other private schools to which he had always gone. He had won awards in oils, watercolors, pastels, all of which he later pawned, one by one, in their beautiful frames, off our sitting room walls, my sister said, to get money to drink. I couldn't understand, when I was very little, how anyone could drink money. Papa had been planning to leave for Paris by boat in a few days, long before the time of overseas jet planes, when he had met my mother and married her without asking his parents. My parents knew. He had asked their permission. I am of age, my sisters said. Aunt Flo told them that my mother had told her Papa had said. Wait, I am of age, my sisters said. Aunt Flo told them that my mother had told her Papa had said. But they might try to stop me in some way. I know them. Of course, I knew that that meant he knew them very well. I knew he knew who they were. Ma had caught Papa's black eyes with her violet ones one Sunday evening when he was hanging around on a street corner in Dorchester, in front of an ice cream parlor with some other young swells, rich boys, smoking cubebs. Cubebs were cigarettes and were something new on the market. The word cigarette meant small cigar in Spanish. Cigars had been on the market from Havana, Cuba, for some time, and pipe smoking and chewing tobacco from the American South and Egypt and Turkey, far away. The American Indians were supposed to have introduced the use of it to the white man when he came to the United States, which weren't the United States then. Why'd you spell it weren't? But the Indians didn't smoke it every day like the white man did later and got ill from it. His chiefs only smoked it and only at powwows, meetings with chiefs or other tribes for peace, because it settled their nerves, the same as alcohol does. At first, for the alcoholic or their nerve endings as they taper out into sometimes difficult pressures of the atoms of the atmosphere and from those people around him. There were also Bull Durham tobacco in a pouch that men used to roll. There was also Bull Durham tobacco in a pouch that men used to roll their own cigarettes by pouring it into a small oblong paper as thin as tissue paper and gluing it along the side with their spit from their tongue. They would draw the strings of their tobacco pouch together with their teeth so it wouldn't spill. At the same time, with the other hand, it had been a favorite of the cowboys out west. But cubebs were cigarettes that were already rolled by a commercial company for the first time, smoked by city folks. Some people claim to be smoking mentholated cigarettes only because they were good for asthma. Some people said it was sinful, nevertheless, rather than not good for the body. There were Violet Marlowe's also using scented tobacco for the ladies for the first time. There were ads in the newspapers paid for by the government warning people not to spit on the sidewalk or be fined, as men who smoked cigars often did if there wasn't a spittoon handy, as in a saloon or a hotel lobby that someone had to clean out the next day and keep polished. The ladies who smoked didn't spit. Ma and her girlfriends who didn't smoke at all were returning from evening church services. Aunt Flo told my sisters, who told me, and Papa had followed them home and asked to meet her parents. In fact, her parents had come to the door in alarm and went out on the front porch when they saw them coming up the street together. Grandpa Clark still had on his policeman's uniform, and Papa may have wondered for a moment into what he had gotten himself, but he introduced himself politely and asked if he might visit them for a spell. Apparently, they agreed, and he became a regular Sunday evening visitor, and even attended evening church services with Ma and her parents now and then. But it was a long time before my grandparents left Ma and Papa alone in the parlor, my sisters said. Aunt Flo told them. I never saw my grandparents. My mother's parents died before I was born, a few years after witnessing the quiet civil ceremony at Boston City Hall, when my parents were wedded. My father 21, my mother 18, just under the law. I often thought perhaps I could be either one of them reborn to finish up something I didn't do as one of them, as part of some big overall plan of the atomic universe or of this little planet Earth. So much gets left undone. She mentions that because she believed in reincarnation and that the spaceships would come and take people up to civilize them for society, if that makes any sense. And I also believe that she believed she was reincarnated from her dead older brother named Johnny. But we'll get to that later. My father's parents died after the divorce and after I was born. They wouldn't have wanted to have been reborn as me, either one, anyway, if they had anything to say about it, which I doubted. But they would have had to have died before I was born, if we are the same individualized aggregate of atoms, expanding and contracting and rising in atomic vibration, according to a theory about the atomic nature of living being and rebirth that began to form in my mind slowly through my formative years. Not the same as the Hindus thought, reincarnation, when one might come back as anything, a mixed up idea of rebirth, although the Jews I had read in the Bible thought Jesus may have been Elijah, come back alive, and could, since he went alive in a fiery chariot or spaceship into the heavens, or heaven, or to a more advanced planet, one and the same thing. I figured out right or wrong. The first Christians were Jews also. And that will be all for now. Goodbye, bruv. Goodbye.